Our social media campaign at the moment asks, what does public art mean to you? And for me, it means telling a story and building community. And we are honored to have Jean-Marc Superville Sovak, all right, I was close. I was so close. Here to tell us the story of and his art.
Thank you. Hello. Thanks for coming out on a Thursday, beautiful Thursday night. Happy Passover for everyone's still celebrating. I see there's macaroons available, still left over. What I titled the work or the presentation today in the light of what I think of as public art is exactly what I wanted to share with you today. I've been working as an artist for a while. Only recently have I begun calling myself a public artist. And I think it's important to define what a public artist does. And my mother, who's from Trinidad, would always say, well, that's very nice, whenever I would explain to her what I was doing, but she would quote her mother and ask, well, what does it have to do with the price of fish? And it's a totally valid question. And as a public artist, I understand that to mean I need to be able to convey to the public where I'm coming from, and I need to also know where the public in the public art is coming from. So what I call this essentially is answering the call. Because I see public art, I see myself as a public artist, as rendering a service. And so what I want to talk about is what that means in terms of the work that I'm going to show, and then also eventually the work that'll be at Cropsey Community Farm. So how many of you have a working definition of what art is? I always feel like anybody who tells you, oh yes, I know, I always feel very skeptical. But sure, go, do you have a?
I think it's an expression of the soul.
Expression of the soul. Works for me. Anybody else? Art, like I said, it's okay to be skeptical. Anybody who tells you, oh, I know what art is, you should, yes?
Well, I can tell you what Picasso said it was.
What did Picasso say?
El arte es la mentira que dice la verdad.
The lie.
Art is the lie that tells the truth.
Which is, coming from Picasso, someone who seems to have had a little difficulty with truth, generally speaking, in his personal life, that would definitely check out. Yes. Anybody else? Art. Yes. Laura. Yes. Lisa. Sorry. No. Well, I will share mine. This is the only one I have genuinely found to sort of be a working definition that works for me, which is a quote by, it's a little problematic, an artist you may have heard of, who has a sort of also a bit of a troubled history. But what Carl Andrews said is that art is the response to an unspoken desire which it anticipates and fulfills without warning. It's a bit of a mouthful. Let's say it again, right? Art is the response to an unspoken desire which it anticipates and fulfills without warning. And this to me is an excellent working definition. Why? Because when you say that art is the expression of the soul, it also anticipates, it tells us what we don't already know. And predominantly, art for me is when we are confronted with things we don't know, especially when looking at history, when there are gaps in history. I feel that us, as an artist, it is my obligation to invent ways of knowing. Okay? So, I spend a lot of time teaching, so if I have my teacher voice on, forgive me. How many of you recognize this landscape? Does it look familiar? Yes. Okay. There's a reason it looks so familiar. And when you say the Hudson Valley, would you refer to this type of painting in any particular way? What would you call it? Or what?
Well, Hudson Valley School.
Hudson River School.
So
It is absolutely recognizable in the way it has defined the landscape as we understand it today. Absolutely. When I moved to the Hudson Valley about 14 or 15 years ago, my understanding of what the landscape looked like was absolutely defined by the precedent, by what we know of as the Hudson River School of Painting. What I would like to show you is that in many ways, this, what we think of as the Hudson River School, is the lie that tells the truth. What lie and what truth is the question. How many of you recognize this painting? You can go see it today. Yeah? It's down at the Met. It's in the American wing. Do you want to shout out who you...
I know it's the Oxbow or something.
Yes. So the shortened title is the Oxbow. It's the Connecticut River after a thunderstorm by a painter who's thought of as the originator, if you like, of the Hudson River School, Thomas Cole. And for someone who wasn't an American to have defined what is thought of as the first American art movement, that's a little bit of chutzpah. That's quite admirable. So, but generally speaking, Thomas Cole's vision for what landscape painting was to be was defined by the way in which landscape painting had been understood up till then. Landscape painting was not a high form of art. There was a strict hierarchy in terms of what was thought of as art. You had history, religious paintings, you had portrait paintings, you had maybe still life, and then somewhere down at the bottom was landscape painting. Not thought of at all as a high form of art. And Thomas Cole's ambition very much was to elevate landscape painting to that form of art, a high form of art. And the way in which he did that is expressly visible here in the Oxbow. What do you see, just very plainly, for those of you who are maybe less familiar with the painting? What strikes you? What jumps out at you? Or maybe what doesn't jump out at you? What do you see?
The light.
The light.
Atmosphere.
Okay, can you define that maybe a little bit? What kind of atmosphere, like?
Well, it's changing. It's sunny. Transitional.
Yes, there's some heavy meteorological drama happening. Absolutely.
Storm about to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or it's coming, or it went. Okay, yes, there's definitely a transition. What if I were to ask you is missing from the painting?
People are.
Where's the people?
There's two.
Aha, where do you see?
Middle bottom.
Huh?
Middle bottom.
Middle bottom? Around here maybe
That's
somewhere?
like all people.
that's about all the people. So what Thomas Cole said and what his strategy was, I apologize, this doesn't quite totally fit in the frame. But what Thomas Cole envisioned was a landscape painting that no longer required a reference to antiquity, to Rome, to Greek antiquity, but that the monumental character of the landscape was its wildness. That's what he was after. And the wildness, this is what he said, the most distinctive and the most impressive characteristic of the American landscape is its wildness. And that wildness was what was so monumental about the landscape. However, he goes on to say a little bit later in an essay titled The American Picturesque, he says, very few generations have passed since this vast tract of the American continent rested in the shadow of primeval forests, and the gloom was peopled by savage beasts and scarcely less savage men. Well now, what does he mean by savage beasts and savage men? What this tells us is that, and it's actually coded in the painting, you can see it, If any of you decide to go look at the painting, and this was pointed out to me by one of the gallery attendants while I was there, so you never know where the scholarship is coming from, just to let you know. But if you look in the mountain here, there's a little bit of a close-up there. Does anybody recognize? What, there's a little odd little detail, isn't there?
Is there clear forest that spells something?
So, I mean, clearly there's some kind of graphic, yes, some sort of reference. If you were to guess what the origin of those letters would be, what would you say?
Spaceman.
Spaceman. What?
Greek.
Yeah. Does anybody go to Hebrew school?
Hi.
There's a chet, yes, and there's a nun. Nun and chet spelling Noah. Noah. And it's thought that Thomas Cole made a very deliberate reference to Noah. Why would Thomas Cole be referencing Noah? What is the story of Noah? Now we have to go back to our childhood Bible stories. What was special about Noah?
He brought them to the land after 40 days of being in water.
Okay.
And he
Portal
ordered the animals.
Yes, yes. So you're at kind of the tail end of the story. But what preceded
He built the ark.
You were right. And for what?
To save her.
The flood. The catastrophic, the apocalyptic, apocalypse, the root of the word is beginning, a new beginning, that God said, I've had enough of you, and we're starting over, right? And he wiped out those who were not part of this new covenant. It's a very, pretty standard tale of a very, how would you say, a very strict God. But the point for Thomas Cole was that the definition of the landscape was one that was predicated on a disappearance. You cannot have Thomas Cole's wildness without the disappearing of the people that you were noticing, right? And that exactly is what makes the Hudson River School the lie that tells the truth. We know that by 1830, 1840, by the time Thomas Cole was making those paintings, or even Frederick Kinsett, going back a little bit, we know there were steamboats, there was industry, there were brickyards belching out coal-fired brick plants. I mean, this, we have to understand, is utter fiction. It never looked like this. Okay? Certainly not in 1857. Okay? So this is what the question that occurred to me was that Thomas Cole and the Hudson River School, even when in later years, as this movement became more popularized and became a sort of manufactured or in a print form, you start to see a certain peopling, sort of a certain popularization of that theme, which coincides with the 19th century sort of burgeoning industry or burgeoning activity called tourism. People have a little bit more disposable income. They decide they want to visit this wilderness that Thomas Cole is talking about. They might get on a boat that would take them up the Hudson River Highlands, maybe go to Saratoga Springs, eventually take them to Niagara Falls, right? This was the birth of what was called the American picturesque. But what, again, is missing from the painting? So when we look at the historical record from 1830, 1837, 1839, this is what the Hudson River School tells us was the nature of the landscape. But when we look at what was happening in the 1830s, in the 1840s, there is equally a political and a social landscape that's as deep and as wide as the Hudson River. And so in doing a little bit of research, I understood that there was just as much print media at the time that was devoted to, in this case, the abolitionist cause. There were people who were very active in producing the kinds of media here. Move it over just a little bit. That was also illustrated by artists who were down with the cause, you could say. This is the work of an artist named Mary Halleck Foote. And so the question for me became whether this information, this social landscape, which in this case was printed in some of these abolitionist anti-slavery almanacs, like the census records of, here you have New York, for example, in 1789 or 1790, we have a total of 20,343 slaves. Good information. In 1820, the number is whittled down to 10,000, and by 1830, 76. What happened? Where did they all go?
It's free.
Okay, so we have evidence of what was called the gradual abolition of slavery. It's starting in 1799. And we'll talk a little bit about why that abolition of slavery was so gradual and whether in fact it did abolish slavery at all. But what interested me is the way in which these almanacs, these anti-slavery tracts were illustrated by these artists, and whether there was a way in which I could extract from that material those images and insert them into the picturesque landscapes as they were represented at the time. Okay? So I chose this one in particular, the village of Boston Springs, not far from Saratoga Springs. You may know the story of a fellow named Solomon Northup, who was a free black man who was kidnapped in New York. Well, he was lured into traveling down to Washington, D.C., where he was finally kidnapped. If you've seen the movie or you've heard of the movie 12 Years a Slave, that is his story. And so the question of whether these landscapes could tell the story, tell the truth that was not told at the time, was something I became interested in pursuing. Zach?
Can you say that again, that last sentence?
The question of the truth that wasn't told at the time of those paintings became, when I could fill those gaps as they were, became the subject of the work. Yeah? Okay. All right. So this is the result of the work. There's a whole series of these original 19th century engravings that I have printed on. So it's a print on the print, which has, I think of it, been updated in a way to a contemporary understanding, or maybe something that resembles more a historical truth. So I call them ahistorical landscapes, even though historically speaking, they should be actually more accurate. Maybe I'll just stand here. They are all original prints that reference the paintings and the other media from which the images are taken from. So this is the landscape of Albany from the 1830s, and the group of figures, these runaways, is taken from another painting by an artist named Theodore Kaufman, which is also at the Met, called On to Liberty. So you have a reference in each case of the original, the source of the painting, and this landscape in which it's been incorporated. And the whole idea is so that the next time you look at one of those Hudson River School paintings, the next time you look at Thomas Cole or Frederick Church, you might ask yourself, I see what's there, but what's missing? Yeah? Okay. This is a reference to that 1799 Gradual Abolition Act of Slavery, and what I was referencing before about the question of whether or how slavery was actually abolished is in the text, which is printed on the print as well. It says, to be born free. So every child of an enslaved woman after 1799 would be deemed free, but, what was the but? Nevertheless, that child would have to serve that their mother's master, their mother's enslaver, 28 years if male, 25 years if female. I'll tell you that. Okay? So when did slavery effectively end in New York? Had you the misfortune of being born July 3rd, 1827, which was the cutoff date, you may still have had another 28 years to serve if male, 25 if female. Okay? So it's a fantastic book, if those of you are interested, by a historian named David Gelman. It's called Emancipating New York, and it explains the way in which the New York State Legislature essentially convinced slave owners that the state wasn't really taking away their property, but that what they were entitled to was what he calls entitlement to servitude. If you want to know how slavery ended, that's how it ended. Okay. So a lot of this work I've been doing is based in the work of critical historians, like Sadia Hartman in particular, in which I thought this quote is really helpful in her thinking, that the past depends less on what happened in the past. The past is never really past, is it? It depends more on the desires and the discontents of the present. I think that this is essentially the thinking that's informing what I'm doing. So, does everybody recognize this map? Does it look familiar?
Lower Manhattan.
It's a very tip of Lower Manhattan. What tipped you off?
Just the shape.
Just the shape of it? Does any of this look familiar?
It's like Wall Street.
Because there was actually a wall there. Yes, back in the days before it was New York, it was New Amsterdam. And what we know about New Amsterdam, there's a great show, by the way, right now. If you go to the New York Historical Society, and there is a sort of like interactive map of it's called the Costello Plan, and you can click on it, and it animates sort of an image of what it may have actually looked like. Zooms in, that's a company garden. So the Dutch were very interested in practicing a kind of form of collective farming, and this is what was available to those who were living in New Amsterdam at the time. And so I highly recommend it. But it's right on the ground floor at the New York Historical Society. So in 1901, there was a huge fire in Albany. And all of the records, that's why there's a huge gap in the census, because all of the British colonial records on top were burned. Everything underneath that had been piled, that had sort of been tucked away, the old Dutch colonial records survived the fire because of what was on top, in an ironic sort of twist of fate. And what we know now from those years when the Dutch Colonial Council ran New Amsterdam is that the Dutch were the first to introduce, to bring Africans to this continent in 1640, as early as the 1620s, actually. And in some of these documents you can see how sort of charred they are. There's the story of the first murder mystery in New Amsterdam, in New York City, in New York, period. And it had to do with 9 enslaved men who were accused of murder and were brought to the colonial council, charged and to be tried for this murder, for murdering another enslaved man. And their names are there. Manuel de Gerrit de Roos, Simon Congé, Jan de Fort Orange, which was originally what Albany was called, Paulo de Angola, so you can see the origins of where they came from, Garcia de Angola, Anthony Portuguese, Klein Antonio, Manuel de Groot, and Manuel Minuit. Manuel Minuit, if that sounds familiar, the fellow who supposedly traded Manhattan for $24 and some hatchet heads, that is the same name. So what we know is that these 9 men were put on trial, and the colonial council had a problem because all 9 of them locked arms and said, we are all guilty as one as the other. We all did it. They said, well, you can't. Who did it? They said, we all did it. And so the colonial council now had a problem because they were forced with the proposition of executing almost 10% of a very valuable workforce. So you have already an example of the incredible solidarity that these African men understood in terms of the case that they were facing before the colonial council. So the colonial council said, fine, we'll let God decide. And so they had the men pull straws. And I'm not making this up. I mean, this is literally it's translated by a fellow named Dr. Charles Gehring. He's up at the New York State Archives in Albany, and he's been doing this for the past 40 years, transcribing, translating, word for word, the colonial council minutes. So what did they do? So the 9 pulled straws, and the fellow who pulled the short straw, his name is the first one there, Manuel de Gerrit de Roos. We know he was the one. He was the one who pulled the straw. Now Manuel Gerrit de Roos, on a cold January morning in 1641, went up to the gallows. I'm paraphrasing, but this is pretty much what the colonial council minute says. Stood on the gallows, climbed up on the ladder, and after the executioner put 2 good ropes, 2 goede stropen, okay, I'm practicing my 17th century Dutch. 2 good ropes around his neck. When the executioner kicked the ladder from under him, well, wouldn't you know? Both ropes broke. He fell to his knees, and the entire crowd cried, "Genade," they cried, "mercy." Clearly, this was an act of God. They said, "We'll let God decide." Well, God decided. And from that day on, Manuel de Roos and the 8 other men were given what was called at the time a conditional form of freedom. They were pardoned and they were free. They were free, their wives were free in exchange for 30 schepel, 30 bushels of corn, wheat, maize, some sort of agricultural product, and ein Vettvarken, 1 fat hog. You recognize it?
Big fat pig.
Yeah, okay, so see, I'm not making it up. However, and this is what's important, this is what it means by a conditional form of freedom. They were free, their wives were free, but not their children. Children born and yet to be born still had to serve the Dutch colonial council for an indeterminate amount of time. Just imagine the position of being offered your freedom in exchange for your children. Think about what life must have been like for Manuel Gerrit de Roos and the 8 other men. So what I began thinking about was, how could this story be told and how could it be represented? I asked myself, well, what was the kind of art that people were looking at back in 1641, 1642? Peter Paul Rubens, I'm sure everybody's familiar with, was all the rage. Everybody loved Rubens. But he also happened to be one of the few painters who had African models. He was in Amsterdam, super cosmopolitan city. And so it became a sort of easy equation to swap out some of Peter Paul Rubens' drawings with those African models that he had already used for his paintings in the manner of these monumental figures to represent those 9 Afro-Dutch men who were referenced in the case. And this was exhibited at the Shirley Fitterman Art Center in New York City. It's the art center for the Lower Manhattan Community College. And you have, at the base of it, a reproduction of that map of New York City with some reclaimed bricks. I wanted to share the video that accompanies the exhibition. I thought it was in there. I apologize. But I had asked a Dutch speaking friend of mine who was able to read the. Let's see if I can find it now. Apologize. You'll see my lack of organization here. Here we go. Which one is it? So this is my friend Marikan, and she was good enough to read the Dutch Colonial Council minutes word for word, and you can hear what it actually sounds like.
Gehouden wezen voor de genoten vrijheid. Ieder manspersoon voor zijn hoofd jaarlijks tot het einde zijn levens toe aan de West-Indische Compagnie of de hare gemachtigen al hiet te betalen 30 schepel mais, zijkoren, koorn, erwten of bonen en een vet varken, geëstimeerd op 20 gulden. 30 schepel en een vet varken. Met expresse conditiën dat haar kinderen, zo tegenwoordig geboren, often nog geboren zullen worden, gehouden en verplicht blijven de West-Indische Compagnie te dienste te zijn als lijfeigenen. Kinderen en een vet varken. Mitsgaders dat de bovengeschreven manspersonen de West-Indische Compagnie hier te lande zullen gehouden. Acten 25 februari 1644 in het Fort Amsterdam in Nieuw-Nederland.
Okay. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Yes.
So the bricks, were they from this area? Are you connecting it to Naya?
I'm a recovering brick collector. I've since sort of limited. Yes, but I've visited the Hofstra Brick Museum, and that sort of got me the brick fever because I originally lived in Beacon, and most of the Hudson Valley, at some point, when the tide goes out, because it's not a river, it actually moves. Eventually at low tide, all those river towns show off all those brick beaches where those brick plants used to be. So these bricks in particular they're one particular brand that I found in Beacon, but they weren't made in Beacon. They're the Empire brand brick. So they literally have the word Empire stamped in them. So using these busted, the debris of the Empire brick plant seemed like a good fitting metaphor. Yeah. Are you a brick fan too?
No, I speak Dutch, and my
Uh-huh.
parents own property, and the coastline of the entire Nyack area is carved this way, like, so this is the land, it's
Yep.
carved this way, because they took the earth to make bricks.
Yep.
So that's why I didn't know if you were connecting it to this area or a different area.
I mean, the bricks serve a lot of purposes, but anytime you want to speak about the Hudson Valley, you have to talk about the bricks and it. Yeah, absolutely. How's my Dutch?
They probably sound very good back then.
It's probably okay. So my work is very site specific. If those of you who are familiar with the term, you may know the story of Richard Serra's Tilted Arc. I think it sort of epitomizes that idea of what site specific means. But basically, what for me it means is that whenever I make something, it cannot be separated from the location in which it's made. Okay, there's a story to be told, and it takes place in that location. So I'm very grateful for people like Dan Sherman, who introduced me to Chief Dan Goswick of the Piermont Fire Company, who wanted to commemorate or create a memorial to their first line of duty death. It's a thing military and police and firemen do. And to commemorate the first line of duty death, who was a man named Thomas Pomplin. I don't know if you can find him. He was the first black firefighter of the company. He's the only one without a uniform. He's way over there on the left. And my first question was, of course, how can I be of service? Like, how can this serve this purpose? When I was referencing before, the idea of public art for me is what service is it rendering? So I borrowed the photograph, and with a little bit of stylization, was able to create that memorial out of the cut steel. And what I didn't anticipate was the way it acted. Sort of, there's a transparency. You can see at the commemoration for the monument all of the former firefighters and present firefighters of the Piermont Fire Company showed up, and they appear through Thomas Pomplin and animate him in a way that I couldn't have anticipated. And so he finally got his uniform in a way. So that brings us to the topic, I think, maybe most relevant to us today, which is the piece for Cropsey Community Farm, which was selected by Rockland County Arts in public places. And here I have to also recognize, in every organization, there's like the accountants and there's the advocates. And they sort of are on cross purposes sometimes. But then there's always some people in the middle who, pardon the expression, just get shit done. And Julie Ramos is absolutely that person who gets stuff done. Yeah. So I'm very appreciative, because none of what I'm going to show you probably would not have happened without Julie's tenacity. You're familiar with the Blauvelt Brothers Farm. If you've been to Cropsey Community Farm, it's now looking very different than it did during its restoration. You can see that the barn as it stands right now is probably like 30% of the original barn is the barn. But I think, what was the budget? I think I remember reading it was like $1.2 million that went into restoring the barn. But the first thing I asked myself when we visited the site and I looked at the barn was, who worked in this barn. Now that you know a little bit about this Dutch history, and I was familiar with this Dutch history, knowing that the barn was built in 1790, I believe. I thought that was a particular date. I started looking a little more into this family of Blauvelts. And well, wouldn't you know, there's a book called In Defiance, Runaways from Slavery in New York Hudson River Valley, in which it is a compilation of runaway ads. And these are the type of primary sources that have changed the way history is being told today. It's what historians call historical materialism. What's historical materialism? It's essentially the idea that history is not really about the renowned, that most of history is actually about the everyday people, the regular folks, the ones that we don't necessarily pay enough attention to. And so these runaway ads are excellent primary sources for that kind of history, for these biographies that we would never have known to look at or to search for. And so we have here in 1762 in the area, in Orange County, so this is before Orange County split off into Rockland and Orange County, also in 1790, I believe, a runaway ad put in the newspaper by a Johannes Blauvelt. And who was Johannes Blauvelt looking for? He was looking for a blacksmith. In terms of the day, he was a Negro fellow named Adonia, but he goes by Dune. He is of a yellow complexion, being of a mixed breed. No mention of how he got mixed. That's another story. But what struck me in the runaway ad and in several others that are compiled in this volume is that he speaks and reads Low Dutch pretty well. Speaks a little English. He's a very good blacksmith. Understands a little of the cordwainers and the carpenter's business. This is a very skilled individual, not only in his trade but also in his language. And so the question became, in looking at the number of Blauvelts, and I apologize here, I should zoom in. I'm going to zoom in here. Okay? Every name, this is the federal census of 1790. This is the first census that was made in the United States. Every highlighted name is a Blauvelt. And this is Orange County. Okay, so this is the area. This is the Haverstraw, town of Haverstraw. In every Blauvelt, in every household, there's somewhere between 1 and 9 slaves listed there. See that? Just so you know that I'm not making this stuff up. Okay? Blauvelt, Elizabeth, Daniel, Catherine, Isaac, a lot of Blauvelts. But what struck me now in looking at this barn and learning about Adonia and his trade and his language and his knowledge is that clearly there were quite a few black Blauvelts. Now, how could we tell the story of these black Blauvelts? Well, it turns out that the Dutch, being good Calvinists, believed in their Christianization and taught their enslaved workers to read, at least to enough to make them what they thought of as good Christians. And this both happened in what was the New Netherlands and in the colonies of what today we call the Caribbean, was a form of Dutch Creole that was taught to this enslaved population. It was just a patois, a mashup of these different languages together, but predominantly referencing the Dutch colonizers' language. And so in this book called De Creole Taal, I'm saying that correctly, but he is a fantastic study of these primers that were published in the 17th and 18th centuries, where this Dutch Creole was taught to these enslaved populations. And what jumps out in some of the examples, so some of the primers, in order to teach this Creole, used proverbs, folk talk, you know, the stuff your grandmother would say. Some of it was like word for word, okay, things that my mother would say. Pampoon no campani calbas. I don't know if that's how it was said, but a pumpkin cannot make a calabash, it cannot make a gourd. My mother would say, goat don't make sheep. Okay? I don't know if that means anything to anyone else. What does that mean to you? A pumpkin cannot make a gourd. How would you interpret that?
You are what you are.
That's it. You know? The apple don't fall far from the tree. You know? Like, you can't be what you're not. And so, by borrowing the images that I had been collecting from these prints of African Americans, Afro-Dutch in the historical record, I began composing these images with a mixture of these Dutch, what was called Jersey Dutch or Dutch Creole proverbs, and those images. Anybody want to take a stab? One finger cannot catch lice. How would you translate that? Julie, you're exempt. Yes, no, you already passed this test. One finger can, what does that mean?
You're not working hard enough. You need more of your facilities to get the job done.
Yeah. I mean, you might say, it takes two hands to clap.
Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You can't accomplish anything with one finger.
There you go. Okay. I mean, I'm glad I'm not the only one. Your mouth will buy you a horse to ride. Will buy for you a horse to ride. How would you interpret that?
Got a bargain? I don't know.
Where's the bargain?
Use your mouth to buy the horse? Maybe I'm being too literal.
And what would your mouth do to, get you that bargain, you think? What would you have to,
Negotiate.
yeah, what kind of mouth would you need to have?
That's talking mouth.
Yeah, you know, you say someone has a silver tongue. Does that sound, yeah? I mean, it's practically biblical. These are all expressions, I think, that are communally, we understand it come from a kind of agrarian society. You know, it's like this is the kind of folk wisdom that I think we all share. How about the last one? If you don't go into a hole, you don't go into a snake hole, you're not gonna find. I think Lisa, that was your favorite one. What does that possibly mean? It's probably a good one for the news these days.
These are from the Dutch book, they're teaching.
I just pulled them right out. I didn't even have to translate them. Those were the word for word translations.
Did you read the whole proverb?
If you don't go into a snake hole, you won't hear snake news. Yeah. Yeah.
That sounds like gossip.
Be willing to go where the truth is, even if it's difficult and challenging. You just have to be determined to get there, to go there.
Snakes are no snakes.
Just
Go where you need to go.
surround yourself with. Or could it be like just why would you go into a snake hole? You don't care about snake news.
I mean,
It's dangerous, or there's some danger in it. Like, don't go in a snake hole if you just want something superficial. You know what I'm saying? Like,
I'm with you. I don't feel the need to go in any kind of snake hole.
all you're gonna get is snake news.
This is it. I mean, I interpret it to mean, if you're looking for trouble, chances are you're gonna find it.
Oh, okay.
Right? Does that sound?
Yeah.
Does that sound plausible? Yeah? So I was fortunate enough to make this proposal to AIPP, and it seems like this was something that felt appropriate in terms of maybe not a lie, but maybe what the critical story that I was talking about, Cynthia Hartman, what she calls critically fabulating. Yeah, so I'm gonna stop calling myself an artist. I'm gonna say I'm a critical fabulist. Right? So we can guess about, you know, what the lives of the people who were on this farm, speculatively speaking, what were they talking about? What kind of wisdom were they sharing amongst each other? But essentially, the idea is to find a way to visualize this story that's been unwritten and to give voices to those who up till now have been unheard. Pardon me. I'm just going to pass around. This was like an early sample of what was feasible with the fabricator. Have that made. The current pieces are much more simplified than that because basically I found out that the water jet that cuts the steel is priced at the inches. It's by the inch. So every time that thing moves, there's a little meter, there's a little ching.
Jean-Marc,
Yes.
could you explain to the audience
Yes.
why this one fellow is dressed in such a grand way?
Sure.
I don't picture the slaves dressed in such finery.
So this is, Julie's referencing the sculpture that's on the right. This was image borrowed from a portrait of William Lee. Those of you know the history of George Washington, know possibly of William Lee. He was what was we call his valet. So everywhere George Washington went, William Lee went. And what was particular about William Lee is that he had a uniform completely tailored to his to William Lee, but that matched exactly George Washington. So when you saw William Lee, you knew he wasn't just nobody. He was George Washington's, you know, valet. Oh yes. So thank you. So what struck me in Adonia's description, when he ran away, we didn't mention. It says later down, the bottom third of it. I don't know if you can read it. It says he had been whipped the day before he went off, which may be seen pretty much on his right side, and he pretends to be free, and perhaps will get a pass for that purpose, right? And I just pay attention to the description of what he took on, what he took with him. It says he had on, when he went away, homespun trousers, shirt, gray waistcoats, felt hat, took with him a checked shirt and trousers, a white shirt, and a pair of blue cloth breeches. I mean, where is he going with all these clothes?
Yeah.
Right? Now, what would you suppose was his intention? And it actually says it.
Keep changing it to see what get caught.
And what would make him not get caught?
Because they wouldn't be looking for the guy with the blue shirt. That blue shirt was no longer with him.
so he has to, you know, play this subterfuge. But what strikes me is the sentence when it says that Johannes Blauvelt knows very well that he will pretend to be free. He pretends to be free. So it's kind of fake it till you make it.
Exactly.
Right? Like he has to not only look like he's free, he's got to talk like he's free. And that is his ticket to freedom. And so this very fancy dress in borrowing the portrait of William Lee was a reference. I did want to sort of have a little wink and a nod to that reference to Adonia or Doom as he was called, and speculatively imagine whether he actually did, you know, hit the road, pretend to be free, and maybe even acquired his freedom one way or another. by any means possible.
Yeah.
All right. So I leave you with a quote by Darren Walker. Those of you who follow philanthropy, you might know of Darren Walker, he's president of the Ford Foundation. He's really kind of transforming what we think of as philanthropy as such. He was the first to encourage folks during COVID to actually not scale back their donations, but actually scale them up, that it was actually the other way around. But he talks a lot about, in his commencement speech, and I forget where, but you can find it online, about growing up black and poor in rural Texas, and how his grandmother used to bring home the like home and garden kind of magazines and stuff from the places where she worked as a domestic, and it was his first introduction to art. It was his first sort of imagining of a world outside of the sort of little shotgun shack that he lived in. But he has become a great advocate for art, and the equation that he makes for me is something that I keep with in every project that I pursue, which is without art, there is no empathy, and without empathy, there is no justice. It's a beautiful commingling of these three things that you wouldn't think of as being necessarily related, but the equation bridges them together. And that's what I'm after. I'm interested in, as a public artist, being both of service, the service of what? Of art, but then also of justice. So if this work to be installed at the Cropsey Community Farm soon, I don't think we have a we don't have a hard date yet. There's still some landscaping to be done ahead of time.
But they are fabricated.
They're fabricated. They're sitting in Bob Gruffy's office, maybe somewhere.
They're being very carefully stored by the county.
I know they are, because you know what? Julie said so.
I have to say that I've seen the panels. They're beautiful. They're finished in a deep blue, a reference to the Blauvelt family, which is Bluefield, Blauvelt. And I just wanted to ask you a question. The Blauvelts actually owned, not all the Blauvelts, because they were all over this country.
Yes.
But the Blauvelts that created the farm that's now known as Cropsey.
Yes.
How many slaves, household slaves, did they actually have?
I was not able to determine that degree of specificity, because in order to do that, I would have to go through, the genealogy of that particular Blauvelt family and to tie them to the census of the time. I'm not saying it can't be done, but in order for this to work, I think I'm okay with there being some unanswered questions, because if it turns out that at Cropsey Community Farm, the farm that the Blauvelts that owned it at the time didn't own, if it says 0, that they didn't have any enslaved workers on the farm, does that invalidate the project? Then I don't see that as it's not contingent on there being a historical verifiable record.
I understood that they had at least one household.
Yeah.
Slave. And I had read that the northern slaves, or at least in this area, lived actually in the home with the families.
Yep.
So is that what you found in here?
Well, you were mentioning New Paltz. In any of the old Dutch architecture, if you're interested in the history of enslaved people, just look at the attic or look at the basement, because that's where they were. That's where they were the first to start the fire in the morning and the last ones to keep it going at night. So if you look at the Cropseys, the house that's on the property that's on the National Register of Historic Places, I understand, it fits that. It absolutely fits that description. So yes, there was a kind of what's called not a slave society, but a society with slaves. And sort of what I'm interested in doing is also kind of disabusing the public of thinking that there was somehow a more genteel form of slavery in the North. You encounter people every day who have no idea, who say, what? You know, we're the North, we fought the war, we're the good guys, who have no knowledge that not only was there slavery, but it was like the beta version, that everything, the first contact, those first Manuel Gerrit de Roos, 1640, those first Africans were here. They were here. They were in the South, yes, but they were also here. And so it's as implicit in the history as almost anywhere else in the 13 colonies. So I think that's the story I'm about to tell.
So the county, the reason that we are putting these in right now is because the county is building a walking path that will go around the Cropsey property. And these will be installed along the path, starting by the barn. And the barn, another reason we selected the project is that it coincided in history about the same time that the barn was built. The original barn was built on the property, so we had that connection as well. And you will see the 4 panels with the way they showed the two, the Jersey Dutch and the Dutch. And next to it, you'll see a panel in English that kind of interprets those sayings. And you will also see a large introductory panel that will give you a brief explanation of what you're going to see. And that will be next year.
Oh, good.
How big are the panels?
Good point. They're about so the two on the right most and the left are 24 inches wide and 6 feet, 72 inches high. So the drawing is not actually that super accurate, but the two in the middle are a little bit wider, and the Snake News one is the tallest of them all actually. It's about stands at about 88. So they're meant to be, the figures as close to, life size as possible. A little bit smaller. Yeah.
So there will be a public dedication when they're installed, it will be publicized. We'll be talking to a number of groups who already have office with several African American groups in the county, so that this can be something that references history and that our population actually knows about it. So you'll probably see that announced and publicized.
Is that likely to be the fall? Is it this fall?
Pardon?
It's likely to be this fall, I think.
No, in the spring, they're not going to be,
Oh, because of the walkway.
because of what?
Because of the walkway project? It's delayed.
Yes, because it has to be permanently installed.
Very interesting, really. I'm so glad that I did.
Good. Yeah.
The question I have is, I think this is so important. I'm glad I came because I learned about it quite a bit. But once these panels are up, you mentioned some groups in the county that we invited and so on. But would there be any connection to the schools so that young people know, that they're, I'd be concerned after so much work has been done. It's so remarkable what you've accomplished, that young people in the county, that somehow there's some connection to schools and people would find a way to bring them there, they see that what's there.
The Cropsey Community Farm runs a summer camp for children.
I know.
And they also bring children to the farm during the school year. And I think Jean-Marc, you're going to be working a little bit with them
Happy to make myself available.
to create a curriculum that they could work, toward it with this information.
Thank you.
So we know.
So this is what I mean. None of this happens without the knowledge and experience of people like Julie, people like Mark, who were able to plug me in with a good powder coating company to get. This wasn't done by that particular company, but you know, hopefully the sculptures will, you know, endure and, you know, will be a testament to that story. In the same way that, you know, it's not just art, it's also living people. There are still Afro-Dutch with names like de Groot, Donk, Van der Donk, if you've encountered, especially in New Jersey, in Ramapo area. Yes. Random. So those are the descendants of those families, those first, you know, free, not free, conditionally free, that came here, that were brought here, and you know, they didn't go away, they didn't disappear. I'll talk to you soon. Okay. Yes, good to meet you.
But it was excellent.
Good.
And I agree with the gentleman. That video that you did, you should duplicate it so that we could play it.
Absolutely.
When we take the kids to
Yes.
see it once it's unveiled.
Yes.
We need to introduce them with that video.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Bye, Barbara.
Should we turn some lights on and get? I'm happy to, you know, take more questions. If you want to follow all things that are happening.